Welcome to Made for Mondays, the source for digging a little deeper into the Believers Church Sunday messages and finding ways to apply them to our daily lives. Together, let's take a deeper look and find a way to bring Mondays back to life.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this week's Made for Mondays podcast. I am Joe, and who do I have with me this week?
Howdy, Joe. It's me, Jamie.
Hi, guys. It's Jennifer.
Hey, y'all, it's Tyler.
Welcome.
Like a full room. This is good. I like
this is good. And I didn't make the mistake of saying welcome, gentlemen, like I did last time. Nice. Yep, we're off to a good start. We're rolling.
Great start.
Great start. What did we do this weekend? Anything fun?
What did I do this week? Well, I had LDP on Saturday, so
our leadership development
program. It was really good. So that was from like 8 to 11:30 on Saturday. That was mainly what I did, and then I had to clean the apartment. I had to do a turnover on the apartment. So that filled my
riveting weekend.
That filled my weekend. Yeah.
All right. How about you guys?
So Friday I went to a spa with my girlfriend, so that was a lot of fun. And then on Saturday we went to a winery. So
all right.
Wow, that's a good weekend.
You did have a good weekend.
Better than my weekend.
I
Wow.
don't know, Jamie, mine was similar to yours. I'm learning with a baby because it's so hard to do anything. Everything piles up, so just a bunch of laundry and cleaning the house and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, we did have the gang over yesterday for lunch, and that was fun. So we had, Esther's just, I could spend every day with that girl. She's so much fun right now.
Yeah.
And then Trenton, he was passed out the entire time.
Nice.
It's unbelievable.
good baby.
Right? It's crazy how they can power sleep through anything.
Yeah, anything.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing. So yeah, that was fun. That was probably the highlight of my weekend.
Oh, and I forgot. We had to say this for Nick. I got to watch the Eagles. We got to watch the Eagles dominate the Chiefs.
Yep.
So, Nick, that's for you. That's all you get from me.
Wow. Personal shout out.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. Did you enjoy the game?
I watched the first half and then the first touchdown of the second half, and then I went to bed.
Okay.
Yeah, because I didn't care about either team, and it was a blowout after the first half. So I was like, well, maybe like if the Chiefs come back strong in third quarter, maybe I'll watch a little longer. They didn't, and I was like, all right, I'm done.
Yeah, I think a large part of America resonated with the Chiefs finally losing.
Yeah, I kind of wanted them to lose.
Do you like the dynasty stuff?
I don't. If it's the Giants, they haven't had one of those forever. So I don't care if someone else has a dynasty. It doesn't matter to me. Love the Yankees when they have a dynasty, But yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I thought it was good. Did y'all have any fun commercials that you liked? I thought the Martha Stewart doing the glide with the Skechers. That was at the very beginning.
Yeah,
that was a funny commercial. You did?
We were at a friend's house watching. I don't know how I missed it. I don't know.
Yeah, I didn't pay that close attention either. Sorry.
Yeah, well, I had a relaxing weekend of that. A truly relaxing weekend because when we have nothing planned, it's like a little bit of work is sprinkled in there, some cleaning. So I didn't do anything. Awesome. We just hung out all weekend.
Nice.
And then ended with the Super Bowl. So
yeah,
feel good this morning.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. All right, so we are in our Bible reading challenge. This week we touched a little bit in Psalms, and then we're up to Acts 7, I think this morning was. Anything stand out to y'all this past week?
Well, this morning's reading, was it Acts? It is 7,
It's
right?
7.
That's when we first get introduced to the Apostle Paul. So, we often talk about Paul gets mentioned all the time. He wrote a big chunk of the New Testament. But today's reading, you meet him, and he's there consenting to the death of Stephen. And so you get to see the pre-Christ version of Paul. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
It is. I've been reading through, trying to go back through the Old Testament, but Numbers now, and then listening to Acts this morning through Streetlights. If anybody doesn't have it, please get it. It's awesome. But hearing Stephen recount the story and then reading through the Old Testament again, it's just been really thinking about the God of the universe coming here and then working with this group of people that complains to him, and he saves, and they walk through Egypt and say, "Oh my gosh, it was better in Egypt. Let's go back,"
right.
and dealing with us. And I'm like, God, like you could do anything. Why do you choose to work and love us the way you do?
Yeah.
And that's been trying to kind of just sit in that, and just accept the love that God has for us, So, but anyway, that's
that's
where
good.
I've been. But
Jen?
Yeah, I think the thing that stuck out to me was in Acts 6, and it was with Stephen. And I love the beginning where it says, Stephen, a man full of God's grace and power. And then he's talking about, he's doing these miracles because he's filled with the Spirit. And then he comes up against opposition and that they want to debate him. And I love this. I have it highlighted. None of them could stand against the wisdom and the Spirit which Stephen spoke. And I'm just like, man, that's what I want.
Yeah.
I want to be like that.
Right.
Just filled with the Spirit and with grace. And, I've been around a few people like that, and you're just like drawn into that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's good.
I've been resonating with something I read in Psalm 18 earlier in the week. In verse 30, we read, God's way is perfect. All the Lord's promises prove true. He is a shield for all who look to him for protection. And been resonating on that because one, this reading challenge is fun. It's fun to experience the good overlap. So you're tying it to what the early church was going through and all their challenges they were going through. But then I thought about it through the lens of this series we're going through. And I think I want to encourage that, yes, when we're talking about something like forgiveness over the next handful of weeks, it's important to remember that God does provide us that protection when we're walking through something like this, but also that his goal is to strengthen us. And we see that in David's life. Like, he was a mighty warrior and still needed God's protection. But beyond that, once you start walking through it and practicing something like forgiveness, God's aim is to strengthen us through that. So while we always do have his protection, it's good to know that we're constantly being challenged to grow in our own way to strengthen ourselves.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, speaking of which, we kicked off a new series yesterday.
We did.
Is Forgiveness Out of Reach? We began this series leaning into knowing that we need to be gentle with each other through this series and practicing this. It's a very relevant topic. Jamie, you led us into the conversation by pointing out that we have a commonality in the relationship to forgiveness, while acknowledging that hurts demand forgiveness. They come in all forms and shapes and sizes. Why is that so important to address up front at the beginning of a series like this?
Yeah, well, I mean, part of why that's important is even a conversation I had after second service yesterday, where someone came up to me and said, "What do I do with forgiving someone who sexually abused me as a kid, for over an extended period of time?" And I think that's why that's so important, because you could go through a message like yesterday's on forgiveness, and if you don't acknowledge that some of the wounds that people are carrying are just enormous.
Yeah.
And so as I was engaging in that conversation, I was able to say, how do you reframe, how do you recall the hurt differently in that situation? Well, I mean, that's a tough sell for sure. There are some things that you could do, but over the course of the conversation, I was able to at least say to her, you can at least see the value in being able to forgive the person who perpetrated this against you because of the anger that you carry around this. If you can get to a state of forgiveness, you do recognize it would be better. And she did acknowledge that. And, I think, we'll talk more as the series kind of rolls on, but some of those deeper wounds, and I shared this with her too, you probably shouldn't do that by yourself. There's therapists for a reason. You should be in a community of others who can kind of walk with you through that. It's just that's a heavy thing. And so acknowledging that on the front end is just to everyone's going to work through different hurts, different wounds, and it's going to look different for each one based on what it is that they're carrying. And I did, even with her, reiterated, like, it's good to start, like, forgiveness is a practice, and so it's good to start with smaller hurts, and like maybe not starting out with that one.
Yeah, that's good.
Because that's just heavy. That's a lot to do. But like maybe get a few reps under your belt with some smaller hurts that can equip you to realize, okay, here's how I can move forward with this bigger one.
Yeah, that's good. You moved into a moment where I really appreciate it because it takes that relatable feeling to the next level when you yourself share what you've walked through, even in ministry, and recognizing that sometimes the person on the other side may not even be aware of the hurt that they've caused you. That's really good perspective to have that we might miss in the moment like that. So for everybody, how have you handled a situation like that where you've been hurt, maybe even deeply, but the other side might not even be aware of the hurt that they've caused?
Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult to even to know that, okay, this thing happened to me. Somebody said something, did something, whatever it is, and then to think that the story that, like you were sharing, that the story you've rehearsed and told yourself and have experienced could be looked at differently. And I was sitting in the auditorium trying to do that, and it was hard.
Yeah.
Trying to think of things that have happened where I'm like, I know I'm right. I know this is what happened. And then really trying to think of, you know what, man, maybe, or at least something else you said, what happened or what someone did to me was right to them.
Yeah, it made sense to them.
It made sense to them.
Yep.
And even just that shift of mind to think of some of the things that have happened in my life, that helped a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I hope it helped a lot of people.
Yeah.
Just to think, okay, people generally will do things that look or seem right to them, make sense to them, however it looks. And even though it might have hurt me, just to know that they're not, I don't want to, how to say this well, but maybe we're not purposely out to get me, that kind of thing.
Yep.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think it's unfair too sometimes. It's unfair to the other person because sometimes it is in our head. Sometimes our perspective is not reality.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think that's why it's so important, like God says, to go to that person
Yes.
right away, because he doesn't want the enemy to get a foothold in there. He doesn't want there to be division. He wants unity there. So as best you can to run to conflict, which is one of our values here, is that if we even think or we're harboring a grudge against somebody, to go to them and talk to them and to ask the question, hey, like when you did this is how I felt. Is that what you meant? And a lot of times I find that it's not even close to the situation, and I've just spun something up in my head.
Right, yeah.
So running to conflict right away, running to the person, and I think something you said yesterday was believing the best first, choosing, and that's intentional. You have to be intentional. Choosing to believe the best.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. I'm even thinking through the lens of the example you shared with the conversation you had. So it might be important for us throughout this series. I've already picked one of the past hurts that I'm going to look through the lens every week as we go on. But even listing out some of the multiple areas that we've been hurt and try to build up to that, because think about that, trying to gain that perspective in a severe hurt like this person is going through, the practice through that can eventually even get you to the point where you do kind of see the side of the other person on some of these more serious examples we walk through in life. Jamie, you jumped into our 4 stages of unforgiveness, the transgression, perception, emotion, and then the rumination in it. Do any of these stages stand out to you guys?
I think for me, anyway, the rumination.
Yeah, for sure.
Because I'm like, man, when it comes to those things, and then when you talked about when you see that person or hear their name or whatever, and you just get this. I was like, wow, like I do that.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, yeah, that really kind of shook me to think like, man, I stay in that stage a lot more than I should.
Yeah.
Says.
Yeah, that was kind of the eye opener for me too. Just in prepping for this series was, like my self assessment of being a very forgiving person versus what I experience. And my list of people that when I hear their name or whatever, it causes some discomfort in me is way longer than I care to admit. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And then you gave us a great example in scripture of Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
Did that resonate with y'all with the stages of forgiveness that were listed out?
I mean, I think so.
Yeah.
Just looking at Cain, but even the way you described it, like the stages that he must have went through to get to the place of doing what he did, like he didn't start there.
Yeah.
It had to take some time, even though like the way scripture described it, it seems like it was really short. But to get to the place where you can do something like that,
Right.
just,
yeah, and that's such a great illustration too of the perception piece that, that can be so skewed, because Abel literally did nothing to Cain. And yet Cain acted out against him. So clearly his perception was that somehow it was Abel's fault.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's just really interesting to me.
It is interesting. I think that Cain was, I could be wrong here, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're going to label which stage he was at when he was hearing from God, it seems like he was hearing from him not enough ahead of time in this process, like not seeking God in the stage of perception around it, but rather like we see that the emotion stage is what ultimately won with him. The jealousy and anger, he couldn't subside. And so I think seeking God earlier in that stage, when the transgression happens, you feel it on your heart. The Holy Spirit's going to let you know when something's staying on your heart that it needs to be addressed, and to ask for the perspective around it ahead of time, I think is important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even like what Jen said, like I don't, scripture, the way it describes, you can't know this for sure, but it probably wouldn't be too far of a stretch to guess that he probably didn't talk to Abel about
Right.
any of that,
Right.
So
Well,
Yeah.
it is
Just be-
I wonder if he was thinking, oh, God must love him more. And that couldn't have been farther from the truth.
Right.
Right.
God just wanted to bring him to a place where he was obedient in relationship with him. Like even to say, like, why are you thinking like this?
Right.
But how often we do that ourselves. And it just, for me, a litmus test is when I lose my joy. And it's not that I know for a fact God does not look at me and say your emotions are bad. He made us with emotions, right? But what he doesn't want is our emotions to lead us and rule us. And so I am learning, I won't say I've learned it, but I am learning that when I lose my joy, I have to start, okay, God, what do I need to work on? There's something in me that I need to work on. And I'm trying to do that more than focus on, well, that person did that, or this circumstance is this. I'm trying to be introspect, just like look at myself. Okay, what is it that you want me to work on?
Yeah.
And that's a better place to be.
Yeah.
It's not an easy place to be, but it's much better than living in that turmoil constantly over and over again.
Right. And it's also good to know what that trigger is for you personally, to find that, okay, for you, it's the loss of joy that triggers this. Okay, take a step back and seek the Lord. That's really good. Jamie, you moved us into a section of the sermon where we talked through self-benefit condition and then versus like empathy-based forgiveness. So with the self-benefit condition, what are some of the benefits of forgiving someone else so that I will feel better?
Yeah, and there's been a lot of research done around it and a lot written about it. And living in the state of unforgiveness, it's just not good for you. So it causes it's long-term stress. So there's there are studies that show that benefits of forgiveness are you lose resentments, your blood pressure can go down, your cardiovascular health can be better, you can have fewer headaches. I mean, there's all kinds of health benefits, not to mention emotional, mental benefits of not carrying resentments. The joy, like if you're harboring bitterness, resentments, it's difficult to experience joy. So those are all things that, like, if you do forgive someone, you're gonna reap some benefits from that. And it's not like I said yesterday, it's not a bad reason to forgive. It's what's interesting is just that the research shows there are shorter term benefits for that. If that's your motivation, there are shorter term benefits. There are benefits, but they're shorter term.
Yeah.
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 No, that's good.
Yeah. So the empathy-based forgiveness, on the flip side, it led us right into our big idea. Forgiving is forgiving, not forgetting.
Correct.
That was a tough little tongue twister there.
If you don't have it written out, it doesn't sound right.
Right. Have you wrestled with the idea of forgiveness being a decision versus an emotion?
I mean, as I said yesterday, that's what I've always taught, that forgiveness is a decision, and it is ultimately it is. But you can decide to forgive someone and still have all kinds of gross emotions around the person. And what Worthington talks about in this book is if you forgive for the altruistic reason of forgiveness, you actually start to experience heart change, feeling change around this person, around this situation, that allows for longer term benefits from that forgiveness.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I would agree with that 100%. I feel like there's times in my life, if I waited for my emotion to catch up to my obedience, I would never get there. So I have to choose to obey and trust, ultimately just trust God with that. And every time, and it's not like instant all the time.
For sure.
The depth of the hurt, right, usually dictates that.
Yeah.
But eventually God starts working in your heart to change that, So I just think as Christians, we're called to forgive, and that is not easy. But it's easier when you remember why we're here in the first place, what God has called us to in the first place. It's so much bigger than us. It's so much bigger than our small circumstances, that we are called to bring people to Him. And when I have that clearer perspective, it makes forgiving and honestly surrendering to God so much easier. It's not that I don't have to work through emotions and process and go to Him, and it sometimes is a minute by minute surrendering over and over and over, but just remembering why I'm here in the first place and what He's done for me,
Right.
definitely helps move me in the right way.
Right.
Yeah, no, and I love, even when you brought this up, Jamie, to put words behind something like this, because I always thought it was weird. So especially when something happens to someone that is like morally and justifiably just evil or wrong, whatever it is, and then the person who was offended forgives the offender, there was always a little piece of me that says, well, but that's still like wrong though. It's still just this. Yeah. So how do you get to the place where you can have good feelings or emotions to like the perpetrator, whatever it is? And then as I was listening yesterday, I just started thinking really about Jesus toward us.
Yeah.
Because we are morally outright wrong against Him, and yet He forgives us, and He doesn't just stop there. He actively loves and pursues us. I mean, even like Hebrews came to mind, like for the joy that was set before Him, He endured the cross. Yeah. So like the joy that's set before, what do you mean? That's that. Like like to be able to look at someone and have those feelings of emotions that can be good towards someone through forgiveness. I was like, wow, okay, that's a real thing. Yeah, because God does it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that we can do that too at some point.
Yeah, it's good.
I think sometimes the benefit's not just for ourselves, but because unforgiveness affects everyone around us as well. Yesterday, as I was walking out, I was just talking casually to somebody, and in the midst of that, she just kind of broke down and just said, I wish my husband was here, because he's dealing with unforgiveness with his mom. And I just wish he could have heard this sermon, because it affects everything.
Yeah,
it affects
sure.
all your relationships around you. Like you had talked about that question, how do you choose, or how can you choose to trust again? And not necessarily that person, right? But then it becomes, can I trust this person now, or this person? And it's exactly where the enemy wants us.
Yeah.
You know, not to have community, not to trust God even. And so it's a vicious cycle. It's really hard.
Yep.
Right. I think I think it can be both. I think it can be a decision and one with emotion tied behind it. I think we're chatting through some of the heavier questions we have to wrestle with through this process. And another big one is you went through towards the end of the sermon, recalling the hurt.
Yeah.
That's going to be it's a tough one, but it's one that's important. So initially, how do we feel the reflex of exaggerating our transgressors' worst qualities? How do we think that'll benefit us? How do we think recalling that hurt will benefit us?
So yeah, you mean if you're painting that person as like that dehumanization process, yeah. I mean, you have to do that if you're gonna really hang on to resentments. You have to see the person as less than. It is so true. Like the culture war stuff that we're in the middle of, like that's so much of what's happening. You know, everyone's painting someone who doesn't think like them with such a broad brush and dehumanizing groups of people so that you can marginalize them. I mean, that's a very common practice. And I think, and we all do it. Yeah. We do it on small scale with like when we're hanging on to unforgiveness, you have to do, what a monster. Like, how could that person do that? So even just thinking through some of the people on my own list, recalling the hurt differently and thinking through, like, from their perspective, what was behind some of the decisions that they made. And I might not agree with some of the decisions that they made, but if I can get to a place where I can at least like, okay, I can see that, I can comprehend that. Yeah. It makes it so much easier to move forward in the process.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's many times where I've kind of mediated a situation, and the first thing I do is try to pull out like why were you thinking that? Or if somebody says so and so did this, and this is what they meant by it, I always turn the other person and said, is that what you meant by that? Mm-hmm. And allow them to like kind of share, well, no, that's not what I meant. I meant this. And it kind of brings out the different stories. And all of a sudden, it doesn't necessarily mean, and I say this all the time, it doesn't mean that what they did was right.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
But knowing why they did what they did, do you think you can come alongside and come to a resolve with that? Mm-hmm. And sometimes the answer is no, but more than the no, a lot of times it's okay. I can understand where you're coming from that. And it's just, hearing the other person out and trying to understand, seeking to understand a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was even hearing that. It just reminds me so much of how much I need Jesus, because it's so much easier to, that person's a monster. They're the worst. And just feel the false power, I guess you could say, from having those emotions and seeing someone like that, rather than doing the hard work to look at yourself and look at them, recognize they're made in God's image too. And they probably had some reason for why they did what they did.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean that it's right,
Yes,
right?
yes,
So
true.
on the flip side, a lot of times people will be like, well, it's okay because that's, well, no, it's still not okay.
Yeah.
But, and we can address that and we can work through that. But usually sometimes there's not this evil reason behind what we do.
Right.
Right. Well, and sometimes it's not wrong. I was having a conversation with my counselor just a week or so ago, and I was talking about the series with him that we're doing, and he talked about this idea like you can be hurt by someone who didn't actually do something wrong, but it still hurts you. It doesn't negate the
Yes.
hurt that you experienced, but it wasn't necessarily a wrong thing. And he used the illustration of like someone having a bad sunburn on their back and someone comes up and pats you on the back. Hey, good to see you. Well, that pat on the back was not wrong. Like any other time, that would have been a very okay thing to do. But in that moment, it was very painful. And you could explain like to the person who hurt you, this is why that hurt.
Right.
That doesn't mean that they necessarily did something wrong, but now I have to figure out how do I relate to you differently, because if I relate to you in this way, it can be hurtful to you. So I need to relate to you in a different way. And this way wasn't wrong. It just can't be received by this person.
Right.
So trying to figure out another way to do that. I thought that was a super
that's really
helpful
good.
way to
Yeah.
look at that.
Yeah, that's really good. So we've been chatting through ways that we can connect with our transgressors' humanity,
Yeah.
really, and how that can be helpful. So you brought up the VCU driver. Such a good story.
Yeah, that's
my
a good
wife
story.
loved that part of it. Have y'all had examples like that? I often say, or I used to say rather, that life is all about giving people the benefit of the doubt. Like if you can do that well, man, life's going to go pretty well for you. So yeah, it's a good example of it right here, connecting to their humanity. Have we had any moments like that?
So I remember when I was throughout high school, I always worked at a summer camp and just stay there the whole entire summer. And I remember this one summer camp that we worked at, there was a maintenance guy that worked there that everybody absolutely hated. He wore overalls all the time. He was like big and gruff, never smiled, never was kind, always just like grumbled and yelled at you and different things like that. But I don't know, God just put such a soft spot in my heart for him. And so I would always, when I would see him, they would, everybody else would be kind of laughing and making fun of him or whatever. And I would try to like, well, can I help you with this? And he would immediately be like, just yell at me about something. And I'm like, okay. But I remember one time walking through the woods and somebody must have had a party somewhere. There was cans everywhere and he was out there like picking them all up and stuff. And I was like, gosh, okay, I'm going to try again. And my friends were like, are you crazy? He's going to yell at you. And I was like, I don't know. Like, I just feel bad. And so I just walked over and I said, can I help you pick these up? And he didn't answer me. So I was like, okay.
But he's not yelling.
He's not yelling though. So I just went and I started picking things up. And from that moment on, like it was different. And that's why I think we just don't know what people are going through.
Right.
No.
Yeah.
Why did he even choose to work there in the first place? Maybe there was a circumstance where that's all he could do. And then, maybe somebody makes fun of him. And so then he puts his guard up, almost like that trusting.
Yeah.
I'm not going to trust anybody else.
Right.
And so what's it going to take to kind of break down that wall, in that person's life? I wish I was always like that. I'm not always like that. Sometimes somebody says something to me and I'll say something right back, depending on where I am in a circumstance. But I want to be like that all the time.
Yeah.
I do have examples, but when it did come up to me, just thinking is before I had a kid, when I'd be either trying to get into a parking space or leave one, and I'd see a family coming with a bunch of kids, I'm like, oh my God, this is going to take forever. They're going to be trying to get the kid. But now that I have one and trying to get him in and out of the car, it just takes time.
Yeah.
It's hard. And I look back on myself and you're just an idiot, man. Like, why would you ever think, anyway, that's just a small thing.
No, it's a good example of the lens we can put on when we start chatting through some of the heavier parts of life, for sure.
Yeah.
And speaking of that, I hope we get several throughout this series, but we did get some what the what questions. I'm not
did.
going to do Heather's thing. That's
Yeah.
like her thing. So
I think
what
I
do
think she's got that copyright.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, you can't.
What do we got? What do we have coming?
So, this 2 questions. We can take them one at a time, I guess. So the first one is, to truly forgive, is there action required of the forgiven? So that's the first question. Is there an action required of the person who has been forgiven in this whole forgiveness equation?
Man, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I mean,
I would
we
love to see what the guy who wrote the book, I would love to see his perspective on that, but I haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't want to
Right, it's
I don't want to do a
Yeah.
spoiler alert on the book, but the person. So Heather will talk about it this week. There's an incredible story behind this author on forgiveness, and he's been a professor, counselor, and researcher at VCU, and he started there. He did 20 years worth of work on the research of forgiveness and kind of became known as the forgiveness expert, and then had just a tragedy that he had to kind of figure out how to walk through, whether he was going to be a practitioner of forgiveness or just have great knowledge about forgiveness. It's an incredible story. And part of his journey of forgiveness, he never, the person who wronged him deeply in a way that most of us will never experience, he never did encounter that person. And he had to work through forgiveness of that person.
Wow.
So, you can forgive someone who has passed away, for instance, like coming to terms with a parent who was abusive or whatever. They may be deceased, but you are still carrying all of the hurt. And so in some ways, you have to do, from my perspective, I have to do some things about that person, recalling the hurt differently, and all the things that we're going to talk about in the rest of the series. But there is no requirement of reciprocity on the part of the other person. Otherwise, anyone who experiences a hurt where they can't be face to face with someone, they would just be perpetually stuck. And fortunately, that's not the case, So the short answer is, I guess, to move to reconciliation would be a different piece.
Yeah.
That would require something on the part of the forgiven. But for forgiving, I think the answer is no, there's not.
I was thinking that too with reconciliation.
Yeah.
And then I read the verse that God reconciled himself to us. But then that made me think, okay, but not everybody has reconciled themselves to God.
Right.
So I'm just wrestling through that. Does reconciliation actually take, because that in a lot of the definition, it's that they're both coming together or reconciling their relationship. But I think that verse is very interesting, that he reconciled himself with us, and yet there's a piece that we have to.
Yeah, so he's done his part.
He's done his part, right?
Yep.
So that makes me think, what parts can I do in reconciliation, even if the other person isn't willing to meet me?
Yeah, I think that's good. And I think part of it is, part of that work of reconciliation, it does require both parties. But God provided everything that was necessary for that reconciliation to occur. So the price has been paid, the forgiveness has been basically offered. So I think, that goes back to that question again, is something required of that person? Not on the I have to do everything up to the point of reconciliation, but that's not required on that other person's part, right?
Yeah.
So it's a great question.
That is a really good question. I love even chatting through the early stages of the difference between the forgiveness process and the reconciliation, because when you have been the transgressor and someone has called you on that and you've walked the process of forgiveness, and you think you've done the reconciliation part well, I think we get wrapped up in ruminating with some of the earthly feelings we have. Like I wrestle with that when now I am on this side of it and I'm asking for forgiveness and reconciliation. I've been forced to look at myself in the mirror and make changes. So some of those earthly feelings, you start to ruminate in that as well. Like I really want this person to change their behavior.
Yeah.
And it's not a part of the forgiveness process. They've done their piece.
Also outside of your control.
Right. Outside of my control. Right.
So this is listed as part of the first question, but it's a separate question, I think. How do you truly forgive someone who keeps wronging you? So that's coming up in 2 weeks, the passage where Peter asks Jesus, how many times do I have to forgive someone? 7 times? And Jesus responds, not 7 times, 70 times 7. So we'll get to that in the third week, but I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that before we get there.
I don't know. That's very difficult to continue to do that. But the freedom that can come from it, I would say is worth. Like that's why Jesus says what he does. I think is worth it. Like I remember a story from before podcasts got popular. You had to listen to the radio, and I'll never forget a story I heard. There was a woman who was in a car accident with a drunk driver. She ended up being a quadriplegic, and the drunk driver walks away.
Yeah,
and her story of every time sees a car in whatever it is, having to relive that moment and forgive that person every time. And constantly doing that to just help her to get to a place of freedom.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I just, whenever that question comes up, I just think of that story and just her and having to do that all the time.
Yeah.
And the freedom that she feels by feeling the feelings come up and then again, forgiving that person. Yeah.
It's a hard one to give a blanket statement to because there's so many different scenarios. Yeah. And so that's why I always am saying, like, I can't give you a black and white answer, but what I can tell you is walk as closely like Stephen in the Spirit that God lets you know, because there are times like you can forgive and it's not wise to reconcile with the person.
Oh, for sure.
And so, but I see a lot of people too just make a stance. Well, if that person's hurt you, you just need to walk away. You need to sever ties and not right. Well, that's not necessarily right either.
Right.
So I think, just really taking that time to bring it before the Lord and just praying about it, because sometimes in a season, there's been times in a season where God says, no, you've tried to reconcile. I don't want you going back again. But then maybe down the road, he's like, okay, now it's time. And you're not going to know that unless you're walking in the Spirit. And so that's why it's just so important, that relationship, like Stephen, just to walk so closely in the Spirit, to walk in grace, to walk in the Spirit, to keep, to know what your calling is as a believer, to keep that in the forefront of your mind as you're wrestling through all these things.
Yeah, that's really good.
So another question that came in from the same person. So that was part 1 and part 2. This is the second question. Is there a broader thought to this that is beyond forgiving the individual who wronged you? How do you get back what was lost, essentially trust? And then he elaborates, to be clear, I don't mean just trusting again the person you're forgiving, but also the ability to start trusting anyone again if your trust has been violated multiple times.
That's a really good question.
Yeah. Thoughts?
I would say to that, there is a great point of not doing this alone. I think you mentioned that before. Just something when it's that deep, that hurtful, to have someone outside of yourself that you can process with. Because if we try to do that on our own, I just think we spin the wheels most of the time. Sometimes we can find healing in that way. I'm not saying that that's not possible, but that's why therapists exist. I mean, you mentioned that before. We have several times from stage, but just to have someone who can help you think about things differently, because that's so hard for us to do on our own. We're looking at it from our perspective. Someone can ask different questions who you can process with. I think is invaluable. It is so helpful.
Yeah.
I could be wrong, but I would guess that person is also wrestling with trusting God. And so I would say start there. Start figuring out who your God is and how much he loves you, and start building that trust up again. Because until that trust is built, you're not going to trust other people.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
I think similarly to reconciliation being different than forgiveness, trust is also different than forgiveness. So, it's not always wise. Like if there can't be reconciliation, there is no reestablishment of trust, really, right? So you're not in a relationship that requires trust if you're not reconciled. So, but I also think, I love your thought, Jen, on that. That's really good. And I also think, this whole idea, like if I mentioned this yesterday, but like if everyone who has wronged you, like if you just, your circle is going to get so small, and you are going to experience so much isolation, which is not the same as solitude, and that is not God's design for us. And so it's almost like that idea of, if loving someone, like, and then experiencing hurt on the backside of that, like choosing never to love anyone again. Well, how much of life are you going to miss out on?
Right.
And so I think it's a similar idea to this idea of trust. Like, no one is trustworthy. That's a pretty big narrative. And so, and you're going to miss out. Like, I think that's the side of that. So you have to just kind of, you're going to have to put your pinky toe back in the water of trust, or you're just going to miss out on most of what God wants for us, which requires relational things to be taking place, and that can't happen without some level of trust, really.
And really, despite the fact that nobody is trustworthy, because if we really think about it, none of us are.
Yeah.
And so that's why, building that relationship with God, who is the only one that's trustworthy, that the only one that can bring salvation, and that will always have our best interest in mind, is so critical.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So
Yep. Well, before we leave it, that's a great segue into some encouragement that we can't figure all this out on our own. And one of the best things you can do, listeners, is to get plugged into a B group. And we've been doing the B group promotions the last few weeks. Mm-hmm. The semester is right around the corner, starts next week, and the following week, all of our groups are kicking off if they haven't already. And building that community to help walk you through these steps of forgiveness, because like we saw yesterday's sermon and like we heard today on this podcast, it's tough. And it takes practice. So if you missed it, you can check out yesterday's sermon on YouTube, or you can join us next week as we continue our series, Is Forgiveness Out of Reach, on campus at 9 and 10:45, or check us out on YouTube at 1 o'clock. Until then, go and be love.